As journalists and television hosts, scripts are a lifeline. Each newscast, each story, it all revolves around a script.
But now it's time to go unscripted. That means we're not just going off script, we're throwing out the script altogether.
Each week, we're joined by fellow Farm Journal hosts and editors to peel back the layers on stories we've shared throughout the week.
Unscripted. It's real, it's raw, it's entertaining, and it's your chance to meet the personalities behind the personalities. I'm Tyne Morgan.
And I'm Clinton Griffiths. Welcome to Unscripted.
Well, I am so excited to get today's conversation started. I'm Tyne Morgan, host of U.S. Farm Report. Clint, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Clinton Griffiths, host of Ag Day Television and editor of Farm Journal magazine.
And with us today, his name, probably one of the most recognizable names in Farm Journal. We call him our Farm Journal wordsmith. He's the best storyteller we have. And I say that lightly because Clinton's a pretty darn good storyteller too.
I'm no Chris Bennett.
No Chris Bennett. Who is Chris Bennett? Thank you for joining us.
Hey, y'all are putting some stripes on my shoulder. I don't want, I'm more like a ditch digger here and pleased and privileged to be, but sincerely, y'all, I'm delighted to be on here with y'all.
Well, as you just heard, Chris is probably one of the most humble individuals that you will meet. But Chris, before we get started digging into some of these stories recently that you've written, some impressive stories that you've written, you know, I've always heard that Southerners make the best storytellers. And I just want to know, is that scientifically proven?
I'm not sure, but I suspect it is because people lie well down here. So there's your bottom line right there.
No, see, Tyne, I would say that Southerners definitely are the best storytellers for a few reasons. One, they're not in a hurry to get to the point. So they're going to take their time, right, Chris? They're going to set it up. I'm going to tell you how I came to learn about this story. Then I'm going to tell you the story, but I'm not going to tell you all about it. I'm going to make you wait for the punchline of the story. And then they bring it home with like a really big sledgehammer. And that, to me, it's just like, you know, it's like mama's home cooking, right? Like you can't do it in a hurry. And it's even better when it takes all day, you know?
Hey, brother, I still believe that we won the Civil War. I mean, don't tell me different stuff. There you go.
Listen, we're not getting into history here. We're not getting into a history lesson. All right. Well, Clinton, I couldn't have said it better. That analogy is perfect. I mean, if I call Chris, hey, Tyne, what's happening? It takes like 5 minutes for him to say hello. And it's my favorite part of my day, Chris. That's why I call you so much.
Hey, life's too fast for all of us. You know what I mean, Tyne? So we got to slow down a little bit.
All right, Chris, couple stories that went gangbuster recently. One about wild pigs versus sharks, but the other one that I want to talk about, power versus privacy. Landowner sues game wardens, challenges property intrusion. That story took off. For those of you that have not had a chance to read it, Chris, I know you can't do anything in a few minutes, but sum up the story for us.
There's a lot of misnomers going on about the power of government on your private land, Tyne. And it boils down to what's called the open fields doctrine. And the open fields doctrine is a law, policy, aim established by the Supreme Court in 1924 and again in 1984 in two separate cases. And when you get down to nut cutting, what it says is that the government, when I say government, I mean that in general, right? Any level of the federal government, any agency, department within the federal government has the right by law to come onto your private land and do as they would, as they will. And if the listeners are wondering exactly what constitutes private land, according to the Supreme Court, anything beyond your house. In other words, you're entitled, according to the Supreme Court, to privacy in your person, in your house, in your immediate yard. Let's say your 1 acre, your 2 acres, your fence, maybe your shed buildings around your house. But beyond that, the government can come onto your land at will. There are currently 4 cases, either in litigation or under appeal, involving open fields brought by private landowners in protest. One of those is in Virginia. One of those is in Tennessee. One in Pennsylvania. And the latest one, the one that I wrote about here in the last 10 days, happened in Louisiana, and it's all coming to a boil. I'm not being a prophet here. I'm not trying to get on the end of a diving board. It's quite apparent that one of those cases or a separate case is eventually going to go back to SCOTUS, and SCOTUS is going to have to answer how much leeway, how much rope that the government has on a person's private land.
I think, Chris, for me, like whenever I've read some of these stories and we've put some in the magazines and on the shows, it's super interesting because whenever this was kind of first ruled on by the Supreme Court, we didn't have drones. We didn't have field cameras that could send pictures straight to your cell phones. We didn't have some of the modern technology that we have now. And so, like part of, I think, what everyone's kind of wanting the courts to answer is, does that change things? Do these new tools make a difference in the way that this gets decided? And we haven't heard that yet from the Supreme Court.
Correct, Clinton. You're also looking at a dual answer or a dual solution that's needed, because you'll hear sometimes people say, well, in my state, right, in whatever given state they're in, the game warden or government officials, state officials can't come onto my property, so I have no concern about this. And there are 7, 8 states, 9 states that have laws in their state constitution that says your land is also protected essentially by the Fourth Amendment. However, the SCOTUS ruling applies to federal officials. So even if you're in Mississippi or Montana and your state officials are blocked from carte blanche access to your private land, the federal government is not. For example, EPA or Fish and Wildlife, or we could go on, USDA, all of the departments and agencies, at least according to SCOTUS, at this point, all of those federal agencies are allowed on your ground. And if you're in a state that doesn't have those state constitutional protections, then it's possible that your state officials also have access to the ground. And once you throw all that spaghetti on the wall, there are a myriad questions that come screaming out. Some of those related to technology that you just mentioned, but also very, very commonsensical questions are, if the government's allowed to come on my land without a warrant, without reasonable suspicion, without a nod from a judge, if they're allowed to do that, are they allowed to stay in perpetuity? Do they have to leave in 15 minutes? Do they have to leave in 15 weeks? Can they set up cameras? Can they set up movie cameras? Who owns the footage? Do they have to tell their boss? Do they have to keep a record? Do they have to write down when they come onto the ground, when they leave the ground? Does the government, right? Does Uncle Government have a record? Does anyone in government have a record of all the unwarranted or non-warrant cameras out there on private land? And this goes on ad infinitum. In other words, the questions are seemingly limitless. So it wouldn't just be a matter of Supreme Court looking at this and putting a stamp on it or taking the stamp off. Because of the state of technology and because of the questions I just said, I think I referred to it earlier as Pandora's box, and I do believe that.
Tyne, I'm not to jump all over that, but Chris, to me, it feels like you can't even get answers on some of those things that you brought up. Like, how many cameras are there?
Well, and that leads to my next question, Chris. What was the most difficult part of putting this story together? This isn't the first, you mentioned it wasn't the first time that you did a story like this on this topic, but what is the most difficult part of putting these stories together? What answers are you still searching for?
The same when I do other government stories, Tyne, and it's absolutely maddening because 99 times out of 100, higher than that, when you contact the government about a case, their response, whether it's USDA or DLJ, their response is, we can't comment. We're not going to comment on ongoing litigation. Well, I can assure you, just as sure as I'm sitting in this dang chair, you contact them after the litigation is over, they still are not going to comment. They take their ball and they go home. So that they treat this manner as they treat most property rights matters, which is they address it in silence. You don't even know, for example, how much tax dollars they spend in pursuit of these matters. So it's a very reasonable question for most landowners, for most people living in rural America. Do y'all have a database of non-warrant cameras out there? Are you required to have one? Does your department have a policy on what officers can and can't do? Can they come camp out on my ground? Because why not, according to SCOTUS, if my loved ones are captured on one of your trail cams or on any sort of footage cam, do y'all own the footage? If, for example, and I don't mind being blunt, if my wife is going to the restroom in the woods, does the government own the footage? It's a very reasonable question. It's not outlandish at all. If two people are sharing a private moment out in a rural area on their private land and that's captured, does the government own that? Who has access to it? Again, I submit to both of y'all that we could sit here on this broadcast probably for several hours and just rip off questions that reasonably should be answered.
Chris, I mean, I don't mean to make light of this, but can you imagine some of the footage that they have?
Right.
I mean, let's be real. There's some crazy stuff that can happen in the woods. You know, you're Southern.
We've all got families. We know what goes on and all aspects of our life, our neighbors' lives, and so on. And I'll say this, and I know that reasonable people fall into this. If I am on private land, I have what I believe, and most people believe, is a reasonable expectation of that privacy. Now, by all means, if there's a suspected crime, even above the lowest bar, which would be reasonable suspicion, if that exists, then I understand why there would be an intrusion. But if those ain't there, and you have the government, right? And this is not about game wardens. This could be about USDA wanting to come onto your land and secretly take a soil sample. This could be about EPA wanting to come get a soil sample. We could go on. In fact, the 1924 case and the 1984 case, both of which open fields are based on, involved liquor with revenue officers and marijuana with police authorities. Those didn't even directly involve game wardens. But it's a far, far bigger ball of mess than what people might want to point to. And one of the arguments that you consistently get, I'll usually get an email or two at least, or a phone call. Somebody will say, look, I don't care. I personally don't care because I don't do anything wrong. I'm not doing anything illegal. Therefore, I don't care if the government does come on to my private land. I have nothing to hide. Well, I follow the ball on that and ask, if you have nothing to hide, I'm betting that you would submit the same argument about your house. No illegal activities inside your house. But
good point.
I'm betting you don't want the government to be allowed access into your house.
I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah. Okay. Well, switching gears a little bit. I would say it's a lighter topic, but it's not. My gosh, can you find a little bit lighter of topics to? I mean, how do you come up with some of these story ideas, Chris?
Crazy draws crazy.
You know what? I actually thought about saying that. Right. I'm glad you did, because I thought about saying that. Have you ever thought crazy draws crazy? But
it's like a preacher that preaches a monkey message. He's gonna have monkeys in the crowd. You preach a monkey message, you get monkeys in the pews. That's it.
Okay, well, speaking of monkeys, wild pigs kill more people than sharks. That's what you say that shocking new research reveals. How did you even stumble across this?
The gentleman that did that fine research hollered at me a long while back and said, this is coming eventually. And so I asked him, his name is John Mayer. He's an incredible wild pig researcher. But I asked him, hey, when it finally comes out, could you please holler? And the date of the publication is 2023, but technically it really came out in 2024. And hey, when I put Hogzilla versus Jaws, pigs kill more than sharks, it is clickbait. This is absolutely, but there's a heavy bottom line to that, and it extends out to the greater destruction caused by wild pigs, the dangers that they pose, what has happened, particularly over the last 30 years. And you could argue that it's encapsulated in what happened in 2019 in Texas, right? Clinton, I was talking to you the other day. There was a death caused by a wild pig in South Mississippi in roughly 1920, something like that, where a man had his femoral artery severed by a wild pig and bled out very quickly. He bled out on the ground. Sons tried to get a tourniquet tied to him. It made no difference. But those kind of things have happened in rural America consistently. In 2019, that's when things, I guess, went to 11 on the dial. I'll shut up right there, y'all. I apologize for being long-winded.
That's why we brought you on, Chris. It wasn't for brevity.
Well, and I think what you're referencing is the death in Texas, right? I mean, that's maybe the newest, most gruesome case that we've seen of wild pigs attacking a woman who was there to take care of some elderly folks early in the morning.
Bingo, 10-4, Clinton. Globally, most wild pig incidents or deaths, attacks happen in India, they happen in China, they happen in Asia. In the United States, it's very rare, even rare, maybe 10 deaths or so less in the last 100 years. But the kicker to that is that in 2019, Chambers County, on the coast in a rural area of Chambers County, there was a lady, she was roughly 60 years old or so, and she was a caretaker for a family. She was a caretaker for a extremely elderly couple. She'd go and make them breakfast, make them lunch, and so on. And she pulled up in her vehicle one morning, roughly just past 6 a.m. She parked in the yard, which she normally would do. Well, she didn't go inside. And eventually they noticed, she literally didn't come to work. And of course, she was found out in their yard, feet from her vehicle, and her body was torn apart in a way. And I interviewed the sheriff that had been on scene, that had conducted the investigation, and it was horrific. It was something out of a macabre movie from the 1960s or 1970s, something you would just bet your bank account this has to be fake or something else. But it wasn't. She got hit by a sounder of pigs somewhere after 6 a.m. Why, they're certainly not precisely sure, but they hit her and conducted some sort of feeding frenzy, just as you would with maybe a group of domestic hogs. If you threw in a 5-gallon bucket of slop right into the middle of them, and you could observe the frenzy. Same thing happened with her. And her lower extremities, she was covered head to toe in all sorts of various wounds. Her pants were gone. Her shirt, jacket was bunched up around her armpits, and she was 100% covered in punctures from tusks. She was covered in bites, and the mandible width on those bites were of all different numbers. In other words, according to the pathologist and the coroner, it looked like a sounder from piglet to adult had chomped down on her legs. I say this without exaggeration. There were portions of her legs which were largely gone, simply gone, not cast off in the yard. They were gone. The only thing in the yard, the only thing around her was blood. There was no flesh. It was consumed. And then, of course, the hogs had left. So when the authorities got there, there were signs of hog rooting all around the property, which was normal for that property. Mm-hmm. There was no camera that had caught it, anything like that. And the sheriff told me that when they sent her tissue off for DNA testing, it came back positive, not for something like canines, coyotes. No, it came back positive for wild pigs, which matched the wounds that she was covered in. And if somebody is wondering how a wild pig is able to inflict wounds like these, you have to realize that oftentimes the adults, just on average, might be from 200 to 400 pounds. Talking about a creature that can, in a short burst, get up to 30 plus miles per hour. I don't know how far they've been documented swimming. I think it's like a mile and a half stretch, or maybe even further. And then the males have these tusks, and on the bottom, right, they constantly chomp. You can go on YouTube and hear them. It's quite intimidating. And if you're out in the field in the middle of the night, there's a sounder out there, you can hear the chomping noise. It's the teeth going against each other. And so those bottoms, like a squirrel, like what happened with the squirrel, the bottoms get sharp. So on these wild hogs with the males, they've got 3 or 4 inches coming out the bottom. They're extremely razor sharp. And then on the end, right on the end, which is it's not razor sharp, the sharpness is on the sides, but on the end, it's very hard, almost like a nail, literally almost as hard as a nail that you would nail into a piece of wood. So that, right, is the ability of these hogs. And the females also have the tusks on the bottom, but they're not present in any sort of length, but they're just as strong. And the female can bite and break bones, for example. So not only are they a survival machine, if they want to turn opportunistic omnivore, that they can be a killing machine. Yes, it's very rare. And certainly there are other animals that kill more people than hogs do. But believe it or not, according to John J. Mayer's research, they rank well above sharks, not just great whites, all species combined year over year in human fatalities. Quite striking.
Yeah, I did not even realize. I mean, my husband, James, he's from Texas. So every time we go to visit, I mean, there's nothing to see a dead wild hog on the side. It's like in the Midwest, you see deer on the side of the road that have been hit. Wild hogs happens all the time. In fact, a farmer told me that his best mechanism to killing them is his truck. He runs them over. That's what he does all the time. I mean, that's the only way. And in that area, we've covered it, Chris, from a crop side of it, the damage that they do on crops. But I guess I just didn't realize what a risk to people until this story came out. But a side story. So in Texas, you can pay for wild hog hunts. I don't know why you would, because they're everywhere, right? So my husband tells me, he said, Tyne, I'm going on a hunt this weekend. I'm like, well, where are you going? He goes, well, I'm going to my mom and dad's. I said, okay. Little did I know that they were paying $400 per person to go hunt. And I'm questioning, like, James, why would you pay this money when you just sit out on your parents' front porch and you're going to be able to kill a hog all the time, right? He's like, oh no, this is different. We're going on this hog hunting. Well, Chris, I just want you to know. You want to know how many hogs they killed that night?
15.
Zero. They went back to James's mom and dad's, and the next day they killed several. So I am here to tell you, if somebody is going to rope you in for a hog hunt, call a farmer. They'll let you come down and hunt for free. Don't pay $400 a head. And let me tell you, I will not let him live that down, that he wasted $400 down the drain on a hog hunt that amounted to nothing.
What's crazy? Like, so I grew up Southwest New Mexico. There were some farms around us, and they used to grow chili peppers. And so we always called these wild pigs javelinas. Which I guess is a Spanish version for wild pigs, but we always call them javelinas.
Is it really the Spanish version, or do you think?
I guess that's what we always call them.
Yeah.
And they were pretty common, but they would eat like the hot chili peppers out of the field, and that was one of, you wouldn't think that they would eat something like that, but they kind of eat anything.
Well, and Clinton, Ken Ferry was doing research, and they have learned that putting like hot sauce, even the powder of it, like the powder that they put on like hot Cheetos or stuff like that, Takis is popular. Like putting that powder in a planter, then when the deer, when they go to try to eat the corn plant, it's too spicy, they lick it and they won't eat that corn, right? And so it's a mechanism to control deer. Brilliant. So my friend in Texas was like, well, I wonder if it would work for wild hogs. But from what you're telling me, no, that's a no-go.
Yeah. So I also got some family in Oklahoma, and they have trapped some wild hogs there because they've been having trouble with them, like rooting up pasture and stuff on the ranch. Yeah. And they found that the best like attractant is like raspberry jello. they would go and they'd sprinkle raspberry jello because it's really pungent. And it's for some reason they love the way it smells. They put it in the back of the trap, and then they'll just come in and they catch them that way.
Yeah.
And
Wow. Clinton, I was working on a story in Alabama, and there was a new level of hog destruction that I learned about. I didn't know about this one. And this fella had consistent turnover, from hogs wallowing in his pasture, which was nothing unusual. But this was unusual. He has lost several calves in the last few years because after the hogs get in there and wallow, mama gets in there and likes it, mama cow, and the calves get in there and they haven't been able to get up. And of course they die. And that's directly attributable to the hog wallows. So the hogs, they're not attacking and eating the calf. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that in his case, he has lost several calves due to wild pig destruction. Very, very interesting.
I hadn't heard that, nor did I think that's where it was going. I thought you were going to tell me then the wild hogs eat the calves, but that's not the case.
There's a guy in at Auburn University, very sharp wildlife biologist. He said he was out one night, and I guess they were checking on some pig sites, and there was a fawn that was being eaten by wild pigs while he was out there, and he could hear the bleats of what was going on. They found the carcasses later, but the John Mayer has a incredible survival story to show you the survival ability of these pigs. He was culling one year, several years ago, and they had some boar that was radio collared, and they went to cull that sucker. And I think Jack was the one shooting with a 12 gauge slug, and then the hog turned at the wrong time and he shot that thing in the shoulder blade. And it essentially, they thought the round had bounced and the hog got away. But while the hog was getting away, the radio collar came off and they lost it. He didn't think anything more about it. The next year, around the same time, he was on a turkey plot, and a wild hog came walking up, I assumed to eat some of that corn. Jack shot it. John Mayer, Jack shot it and took it to his lab to perform a necropsy on it because he realized this was the same pig that he had shot from last year. And so now he had a chance to find out exactly why this pig had survived. Again, it had been shot with a 12 gauge slug. So he said when he cut that thing open on the table, you could see the trajectory of the slug. And what it had done was enter indeed at the shoulder, as he had suspected, essentially gone up the meat of the neck. The tunnel was still there, the scar, and then exited and come out and entered that hog's lower jaw, severing the mandible in two. But the fascinating part of that, among others, was that according to his records, the hog at the point of death weighed more than it had, and it was in better health than when it had been shot the prior year. So Mayer's point was, name me another four-legged mammal in North America where you can cleave the lower jaw. And not only does it find a means to eat somehow, but it actually increases in the health over time. It's quite revealing by Mayer.
That is wild.
This is like a movie, Chris.
Wild.
Once somebody's going to make another Razorback movie or hog movie here in the next couple of years, we'll all go see it.
Well, I was just thinking to myself, I hope no one's watching this podcast before they go to bed, because my gosh, this is not bedtime stories that you're sharing here, Chris.
Hey, I've been looking at some historical threads, some nice warm stuff. Well, there is some blood involved, but I've been looking at some historical threads about how agriculture comes in to our lives, the lives of our forefathers, and the way it all weaves together in this tapestry is just phenomenal.
All right, Chris, real quick. What, in your mind, what makes a good story? I mean, you really are such a good storyteller. Clinton, you are such a good storyteller. Two of the best joining me right now with Farm Journal. But in your mind, what makes a really good story, Chris? Besides blood.
In my opinion, when I'm speaking with someone, they make the story, and here's what I mean by that. There are people that you interview, and they are rare, that write the story for you while they speak. And when you encounter those people, which again is very rare, you latch on. You don't change anything they say. You simply present their story according to them. In other words, there's a canvas and you let them paint the picture. You get to put your name on it at the end and pretend that you wrote it. But when you have those kind of people, the story will write itself. And hey, let me be very straight. I've encountered wonderful stories, intricate stories, layered stories that came out as absolute turds because source could not enunciate or describe beyond elementary level. I'm not talking about agriculture. I'm talking about any sphere. So they can torpedo your story, or they can take it to very, very high levels. And I'm sure, Clinton, I know you feel the same way. And the most magical part of it at all, and I say this from a coward's perspective, is you get to put your name on it at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. Time for me. I think, we've interviewed so many people. You talk to a lot of different folks through the years about, their personal story. And I'm always struck by the fact that you really can find something interesting when talking to almost everybody. Something that's unique, something that's original, but you have to show up and listen. Like, you can't go there with a preconceived notion saying, this is what I'm going to get, and I expect this soundbite, and I expect this quote, and I'm just going to walk away with this story. You have to be willing to hear what they say and then follow up with a follow-up question. And it may take you, and Chris, this probably happened to you, I know a million times, the same for you, Tyne, that it may take you 360 degrees the opposite direction where you started, but you have to be okay following it. You've got to follow the string. And if you do, then you may end up with a gem that you had no idea was standing right in front of you.
I agree, John. You can't be high-minded. I have to approach these stories oftentimes with the mindset of a 10-year-old, and that's part of my personality. So that's not a problem at all. But you have to approach it with a little bit of wonder. You have to approach it with a tremendous amount of humility, because I can assure you, when I first started doing this, I was an arrogant jerk. And when I would interview someone, right, I would actually dangle my own knowledge. I wanted them to know that, hey, I know this about farming, or I know this about something like that. Foolhardy, very foolish. Now I keep my mouth shut, except to steer with questions and let the person speak. And I realize that I truly, I know almost nothing, but I know this, that when I'm on a story or I'm introduced to the potential of a story, whether or not I think it's a good story is irrelevant. And I know y'all have been in a million meetings with other farm writers or other farm editors, and we actually sit there and discuss whether we think a story is good. It's quite possible, if you're in a room full of farm editors, if they think the story is good, that's a clear indication it's terrible, right? So the question that I want to ask, that we all have to, okay, bottom line here, it's irrelevant what I think. Does my reader, right? Does the guy on a tractor, does the family living in the rural community want to read this? They find it interesting for whatever reason. That's the bottom line. If I think it's 10 out of 10, no one cares. If other farm editors think it's 10 out of 10, also, it doesn't matter, because you get stuck in an echo chamber, and it's very difficult to get out once you get in.
Well, and I think your audience. You live in the middle of nowhere, right?
Unfortunately, I live out kind of in the middle of nowhere. And,
I found, Chris, that's
I gotta
relative.
keep my wife happy, Clinton, because if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. She's my queen. And we moved about 3 or 4 years ago. Time was 6 or 7 years ago. I moved just out of the Delta. Now I'm in the hills and just, hey, very blessed with all the insanity that goes on in this country right now. The last place I would want to be is inside a city.
Amen.
Yeah, that's right. That's
I
right.
drive once or twice a week into the city. That's enough for me. I agree with you.
Yeah,
agree with you.
I've also found it's relative whether it's in the country or not. So, like, I live about little place outside of town, about 15, 20 miles from the city here, and people think I'm way out in the country, but I've been to places in New Mexico where
really
you
are.
can hit seek on the radio and it doesn't stop. And to me, that's in the country. I drove a 2-hour stretch down a highway and saw 0 cars one night for 2 hours.
This explains a lot about you.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that's a rule, right? I mean,
That is a rule.
so it's all
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. But even South Bend, I mean, you're 20 miles outside of South Bend, but South Bend's not the city. It's not a big.
No, it's not. No, it's not like it's some big, Chicago metropolis or
Right.
whatever. But yeah, no, I don't know. Tyne, why don't you tell us what you think makes a good story? Because you've written some incredible stories.
I don't know about incredible. But I mean, it's like Chris said, the people. I mean, some of the best stories that I've been able to share over the past few years. It's not like it was, I did an amazing job telling it. They told the story. It's just allowing them to tell the story and making sure you don't get in the way of it. And I think that is the biggest thing, like Chris said, is to make, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to share some of those stories, but you can quickly get in the way if you don't let them be the ones to share it. So yeah, I think that's the key. All right, Chris, we always look forward to your stories. Is there anything that you can preview for us? Is there anything you're allowed to share with us at this point that you can tee up and tease that's coming up?
There's one that it's in the oven. It's out of the oven now. And Clinton knows about it. I interviewed the farmer who owns the land where Buddy Holly crashed in 1959, and he worked that land. And when he was a kid, didn't even know that Holly had crashed there. But the layers of the cake that led to that Iowa cornfield where Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper and Richie Valens crashed is it's actually a poignant story. I believe that it's one of the wildest American stories from the last 50, 60 years. I guess it's a little bit more than that. And also, Tyne, I wouldn't have would be without a completely outlandish story somewhere on the back burner. I've got one coming. It's also done on a couple of grifters, a couple of old school Twain-esque grifters, except their crimes didn't occur in 1840. They just occurred. And one of them was a diamond heist guy. And the other one was I can't remember the director of the International Country Music Association or something insane like that, some title like that. And they got into a fish, quail, fake stock, and indoor vegetable scam. It was a Ponzi. And they presented this to farmers in Missouri, farmers Illinois, Arkansas, Kansas, and I believe one other state. And they hauled in, unfortunately, a heck of a lot of people. And then once they had the money, they took off and the house fell in. It is unfortunately a true tale, but it's very wild as well.
I just don't understand how you find these people. You find these stories. And how long you said this one's out of the oven. Like, how long do you bake on a story before you even, by the time you get the tip or somebody contacts you to the time that we see it on average, how long does that take?
Hopefully, right. You work on it for a month and it's done. But a lot of the times it takes a couple of years. I've got folders on my laptop full of old stories that I contact the people and ask, hey, would you be willing to talk? No, contact me in 6 months. Okay, I'll contact you in 6 months. Or a crime occurred in 2005, and so if you want to get hold of the prosecutor, then you have to get hold of the prosecutor and schedule something 6 months in advance. Well, when I get to the prosecutor, right, I've got to have my questions. I got to have my ducks in a row so they don't think I'm a complete fool, right? Half a fool is okay. So all these moving parts, and frankly, Tyne, that is an absolute blessing to be able to work on all these farm stories at one time. I always say it, I don't know why it is, but in the farming community, I consistently find the most wonderful people in the United States. No, it's no Pollyanna here. There are absolutely some thugs and ruffians in that bunch, but as a group, it's the most wonderful, humble people that you could find. Why is that? I'm not absolutely positive. I know a lot of these people, despite maybe having success now, or maybe one generation away from an ass whipping, or maybe 2 generations away. So they know, right? They know where they have come from. And all of that makes a big difference. Again, I don't say that to patronize anybody, because there are some wild, hairs loose in the bunch. And that's where some of these crime stories come from, right? You look at some of those crop insurance stories, and the level of fraud is absolutely astounding from some of these couples. And you always realize, okay, they're the ones that got caught. So Tom, Dick, and Harry didn't. Let me go see if I can find Tom, Dick, and Harry. Anyway.
But the fact you convinced them to talk is just amazing. But I think, you are the definition of persistence and patience, and some really good stories come to fruition because of it, including that one.
Including this one about a smuggler pilot for drug lords that Chris just wrote. It's the latest edition of Farm Journal. So if you get a chance to read it, you should turn the page on it, because it's just absolutely incredible. It involves a guy that flew and smuggled drugs for Pablo Escobar. And he, we're not celebrating him, Chris. We're not like holding him up as an example, but this is somebody that is cut from the farm his whole life and ended up in this place and a place in history.
I have to say it. I say it publicly. I tell anybody, the real reason that I'm able to write any of these stories is because I'm backed by Clinton Griffiths, and he has been alongside me and supported me through and through. He knows I go off the cuff sometimes, and but if I didn't have the rope provided by Clinton, I could not be a drop. Very frank.
It's just great. They're great stories, and we hope people enjoy reading them. And they're different than you're going to find other places, and that's a good thing.
When's the last time the word cocaine's been on the front of a farm magazine?
I'm just saying. But it's a great story, and it's super interesting.
Chris, thank you. I have a feeling you're going to be a frequent flyer. I wish it was like a punch card. Join us 10 times and get something for free, but that's not how this works, Chris.
Hey, next time I'll tell you a couple of history stories that I promise you will not make you go to sleep. And it's an absolute privilege, blessing to be on here with y'all. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Clinton. All right. Well, that does it for this edition of Unscripted. We hope to see you next time.
Thanks for joining us. You can dive into more of Unscripted on Farm Journal's YouTube channel and listen to it anywhere podcasts are found. I'm Clinton Griffiths.
And I'm Tyne Morgan. From all of us here at Farm Journal, keep it real as you live your life unscripted.
Unscripted is a production of Farm Journal Studios, where no one grows alone.